Okay, so this is part two. So the first, say from 232 through about I guess 37, 30. Ooh, geez, it goes on for a while here. 239 or so is about this whole sort of difference kind of thing. And just a couple highlights from what Bisecker's talking about. You notice on page 236 at the bottom, she talks about how, this is a really central concept in Derrida's train of thought. And on 237, she has this quote from Derrida about why difference is so important. And then she says, to repeat, difference makes signification possible only to the extent that we are able to differ as in spatial distinction or in relation to an other, and to defer as in temporalizing or delay, we are able to produce anything. Difference, as Derrida puts it, difference is, as Derrida puts it, the formation of form. Here we do well to look a bit closer at an essay in which Derrida provides an extension. Well, I won't read that part, but he has this other quote here about difference. In other words, my advisor when I was at my PhD program used to say that Derrida was kind of a one-trick pony, but my response was always, well, it's a really good trick. And so in other words, the way that we understand anything in a Derridian point of view, deconstructive point of view, is through this process of difference. And you'll note that this is a different historic, in a sense of tied to time passing, sense of how we understand the world around us versus Saussure, who tried to take language out of history and out of time. Okay. Now, there's also this reference in this section here to this book, Glass. And all I can tell you about that is that it's kind of a strange book. And here's a quote from Peggy Kampf about that. She writes, one way to describe glass is simply to invoke its volume, 100 cubic inches, 10 by 10 by 1 in the original edition. On its large squared pages, two white columns face off in different type, smaller, denser on the left, larger, more spaced out on the right. Thumb through the pages and you will see a third type, the smallest of the three, cutting into the column at various points, forming inscribed incisions either along the outermost edge or down the center. And then there's a picture here. There are no notes, no chapter headings, no table of contents. Each column begins in what appears to be the middle of a sentence and ends 283 pages further on without any final punctuation. So it's a wacky book. She has a picture of it here. I don't know exactly how well that's going to show up on the thing, but you see like how it's, it's kind of like jumbled together text, and obviously that's in French, so that doesn't necessarily help you out much. But anyways, it's an early book that plays very much with the graphic layout, and that's what I think Biesecker is talking about there as far as that stuff goes. Okay, so what does this all mean in terms of rethinking difference? Well, it means a couple of things. One is that, as she says on page 240, I begin this discussion on text and audience with the observation that whenever rhetorical theorists and critics contemplate rhetorical situation, they do so with some notion of audience in mind. But, as she further explains in that paragraph there in 240, they kind of take it as a given, and they don't really think about it beyond much of what makes up an audience. What is their nature? What are the characters? What's their subjects, if you will? How are they formed? And what she goes on to talk about is the idea that if language itself is a process of difference, if language itself is a process of making meaning by differing and deferring, she argues, and Derrida said essentially the same thing, that our very subjectivity of like who we are and what we are as individuals is constantly evolving in this process of differing and deferring in terms of knowledge of the world and everything else. So in other words, this model is problematized. Especially this audience is not just a fixed point on a compass, on a triangle. Same with the rhetoric, same with everything else. So she talks about this a little bit more towards the end of the essay. So you have to kind of get to the end of the essay to really sort of get to the punchline. But I'll just share this with you a little bit. She talks about this on page 242. She says, simply put, this is the bottom of the page, simply put, the deconstruction of the subject, that's the subject being us, people, both audience members and rhetors. The deconstruction of the subject opens up possibilities for the field of rhetoric by enabling us to read the rhetorical situation as an event structured not by a logic of influence, but by a logic of articulation. If the subject is shifting and unstable, constituted in and by play of difference, this is on page 243, then the rhetorical event may be seen as an incident that produces and reproduces the identities of subjects and constructs and reconstructs linkages between them. And then just a little bit further on there, she says, rather, it marks the articulation of, from the vantage point, well, I'll just read the whole thing. From the vantage point of a decentered subject, the rhetorical event cannot signify the consolidation of already constituted identities whose operations and relations are determined a priori by a logic that operates quite apart from the real historical circumstances. In other words, we can't accept this idea that audiences just are and rhetors just are, that they themselves are moving parts. Rather, it marks articulation of provisional identities and the construction of contingent relations that obtain between them. From within the thematic of difference, we would see the rhetorical situation neither as an event that merely induces audiences to act one way or another, nor as an incident that, in representing the interests of a particular collectivity, merely wrestles the probable within the realm of the actual. Rather, we would see the rhetorical situation as an event that makes possible the production of identities and social relations. That is to say, if rhetorical events are analyzed from within the thematic of difference, it becomes possible to read discursive practices neither as rhetorics directed to pre-constituted and known audiences, nor as rhetorics in search of objective, identifiable, but yet undiscovered audiences. Difference obliges us to read rhetorical discourses as processes entailing the discursive production of audiences, and enabling us to decipher rhetorical events as sites that make visible the historically articulated emergence of the category audience. Okay, so what that means is that this, right, is not a fixed point. Rather, the idea of what the audience, what the rhetor is, what the audience is, even what the message is something that it actually is a part of the process itself of the rhetorical situation. In other words, you don't have a rhetor prior to a rhetorical situation creating a message to persuade an audience, nor do you have a situation prior to a rhetor and an audience arriving, and then you have a rhetorical situation. Rather, all these things are created and interact with each other simultaneously, and through that very, very slippery, tricky process of difference, where we understand what's going on simultaneously by what's different and what's deferred. Does that make any sense? I hope it makes a little. It was kind of fun making the movie, at least. Okay, comment below. Oh, and if you want to comment on the video, then log on to YouTube and make your own